What's up, everybody? Today I am doing my May reading wrap up, and I haven't done one of these since January, but I thought I'd do one for this month because I read a total of 17 books, which is a lot more than normal for me. um, I think on average so far this year, I tend to read about like 8 or 9 books a month, but for some reason, in the month of May, I just was reading a ton. So I read, yeah, a total of 17 books and like 5 or 6 short stories here, which is a lot. So I just thought I'd kind of go through and talk about all these books very briefly. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with any of these. I don't want this video to be super long. So let's just jump right into it. And there is one exception. I am going to be going through these in the order that I read them, but there is one exception. I'm going to talk about these short stories that I read here. There's a few books I have here that I didn't read all the way through. I just read a few of the short stories from. And then also I had one DNF this month, which is also my very first DNF this year, I believe. I'm trying to remember. I feel like maybe there was one other book I DNF'd as well, but I can't think of what it might be. Maybe this is my first DNF this year. So my first DNF is one that I'm actually kind of embarrassed to have to DNF, and that is The Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson. As you'll see me talk about here coming up, I read a couple of other books by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I tried reading this one as well. And this one takes place in like the mid 16th century, I believe it is. Really long time ago. And the language and dialect and everything, it's just really hard to understand for me. The narrative I understand just fine, but a lot of the dialogue and how the characters are speaking and everything, just it's that really old fashioned like English style of language, and I had a really hard time understanding it. And even the story itself, I couldn't really get into it all that much, so I just decided to put it down. So yeah, The Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson. Maybe I'll try to go back to this one day. I don't know, because I really do like his books. I think he might be one of my favorite authors. This is the only book I've ever DNF'd from him. Again, it was in part due to me being an idiot and not really understanding everything in here that the characters are talking about and such. But yeah, that's my one DNF this year. And then some short stories that I read this month. So this is Bram Stoker's Dracula's Guest. This is actually a UK copy, by the way. I don't know how I got a UK copy, but it says right here, made and printed in Great Britain there at the bottom of the page. I don't know if it's coming into focus, probably not, but yeah, this is a collection of short stories by Bram Stoker. And I didn't read this whole book. I didn't really intend to, though. The main reason I wanted to pick this up is because in a book I'll be talking about a little bit later on here, there is a short story called The Judge's House, which is a rewritten version, modern retelling of Bram Stoker's The Judge's House, which was written in like 1920 or 1930 something in here, I think. So, yeah. So I just read the first few stories in this book, Dracula's Guest, The Judge's House, which was really good, by the way. I did enjoy it. And then Squaw, which I think was actually my favorite of the three. Squaw, or The Squaw, was basically about a killer cat, and it was unintentionally funny. That story just had me laughing my head off and just wondering what the hell did I just read. It was ridiculous. It was just such a corny story, but I loved every second of it. It was so bizarre, but it was really good. I really liked The Squaw. If you haven't read that yet, I recommend that short story by Bram Stoker. And then some of the other short stories that I read this month were in this collection here, The Best Ghost Stories Ever. I highly doubt that. I don't know why they think these are the best ghost stories ever, but according to Scholastic, these are the best ghost stories ever in this book here. And there are some classics in here. The ones that I read are The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, The Mask of Red Death. Or no, I'm sorry. I'm reading them in order on the contents list. I didn't actually read that one. Actually, it was just those two. The Monkey's Paw. Oh, no. The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. So I read 3 stories in this book. Yeah, I didn't read everything in here because there's some stories in here that I've read before. I mainly just wanted to read those classics I have not yet read. So I read The Empty House, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Monkey's Paw, and they were all just kind of okay. I didn't really fall in love with any of them. If I had to pick a favorite, it probably would have been the very first one, The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. That one was a little bit creepy and atmospheric, but it was just a pretty basic, like, haunted house type story. Nothing super original. So yeah, I didn't read through this whole book, just a few stories in here. I was really thinking I would like The Monkey's Paw a lot more because I like those types of stories with like a cursed object and like that be careful what you wish for type story, even though it's been done 100 times. And Monkey's Paw, I believe, is the original type of that story, or one of the very first ones to ever do it. But it was just okay. I didn't love it, you know. I think I gave it like a 2.5 or a 3 out of 5 stars. So yeah, I read those in there. Excuse me one moment, I need to grab my coffee. I have my cold brew coffee here. I'm just getting over a cold too, so my voice is a little bit hoarse. Okay, and then the last short stories that I read were in this book. I read The Shadow Out of Time and The Haunter of the Dark this month, and I'll be doing a separate video where I talk about my favorite Lovecraft stories, so I'm not going to talk about these much here. But I will say that I did enjoy them both to varying degrees, and I'm finally finished with Lovecraft's work. So, moving on to all of the books I read this month in the order that I read them. The very first one being Cat's Cradle by William Johnstone. I actually started this book at the very end of April and finished it, like, I don't know, very early in May. And this is my first William Johnstone book, and unfortunately it wasn't very good. I don't think I'll be reading anything further by this author. So I have read a few of his westerns way back, and I remember always seeing these covers like online and stuff years ago, and remember thinking how badly I wanted to read them and how cool these covers were. And this is a pretty cool cover. I like it. And I like creepy animal cat stories, excuse me. But this one just wasn't very good. It's basically about this evil, like, satanic child. I believe she's born out of some kind of ritual, and she's part cat, part human. And they also, like, kind of separate, so they're like two beings and one being at the same time. I don't know, it's weird. And she like rises up from her slumber and gradually starts to terrorize this village. And then there's these other like zombie-like creatures. And there's some cool scenes of like gore and carnage. It reads like a very bad B-movie though. And unfortunately, the plot is just very incoherent. And it just feels like a lot of random isolated scenes of violence. And in between all of these scenes of violence and whatnot, there's just a lot of talking. This is a very dialogue-heavy book, and there's a lot of like political bullcrap in here. Not in the sense of there being trying to be like an agenda being pushed or anything, but in the sense of there's just a lot of focus like on these higher up like government authorities and police involvement, trying to like just uncover these murderers and like figure out what's going on and things of that nature. And they just spend a lot of time talking. There's more time spent in this book of like police and authorities trying to figure out what's going on and just talking about what they should do about it than we actually see anything going on. Like there's really not much progression in this book. And it was just, yeah, it wasn't very good. I gave it 1.5 out of 5 stars. The only reason I gave it 1.5 instead of putting it at the very bottom, giving it a 1, is because it did have a few moments of fun here and there and some just goofy, silly, like, carnage and like cheesy horror stuff, you know, like that you would see in an old 80s B movie or something. So yeah, Cat's Cradle was the first book I read this month. Second book I read this month was Curtain by Agatha Christie, and this was the 40th book that I read for my book challenge. And this is the very final book, the Hercule Poirot book. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly, probably not. And this was a really good one. This is probably one of my favorites so far. I really dug this book. Surprisingly good finale to the series. And it's not a series, if you're not familiar with the Hercule Poirot series, these are like just very old-fashioned, classic like detective mystery types of stories. And you don't have to read them in order. They're all like standalone books. Sometimes the books will have references to past mysteries in them, but you can read them mostly all as standalone. However, I feel like this is the one exception. I would never recommend starting with this one unless you've read at least a few of the other books first, maybe 4 or 5, because with this one being the very final book in the series, there's a lot of things that happen in here that won't have much of an impact if you were to read this one first. So yeah, this was a really good book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, but I wouldn't recommend starting with it. So yeah, that's Curtain. I need to start moving through these a little bit quicker, guys, because we still got a lot of books to go, and I feel like I've already been rambling on forever. Okay. Funhouse by Diane Ho. This is a point horror book, and this one was just okay. I think I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. The Funhouse you see on the cover here, and of course, Funhouse is the title of the book. The Funhouse plays a very small role in the story. It's basically like a Scooby-Doo type mystery. Teens are getting picked off one by one, except it's in a very like kid-friendly type of fashion. And for the most part, there's a few like moments in here, description of like violence and stuff, but for the most part, this one was just okay. I think I already said I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. I don't know what I'm talking about, guys. Okay, the next book I read, this one was actually really surprising. This was The Ghost Next Door, and I'm not sure how to pronounce the author's name. Wiley Folk St. John. Willie Folk St. John. I've never seen that name before in my life. I have no idea. This was a really good book, though. This one surprised me. Now, how I came across this one was on Facebook Marketplace a long time ago. Not a long time ago, like before I started my book challenge. I don't know, a year and a half ago, roughly. And it was only $5, and I just bought it because I thought the cover looked cool. I didn't know anything about it. And I figured it was for a younger audience because the cover looks sort of cartoonish a little bit. And it is a children's book, about a middle grade audience. And it's an older book, too. I believe this was published in the 70s, 1971. And this was surprisingly good. I loved this book. This was just a really good read. I liked all the characters. The children's characters were very believable. I love the dialogue. There's a lot of humor in here. And yeah, it's basically about a haunting. There's the ghost of this little girl that's supposedly haunting this house. And the kids are trying to figure out whether or not it's real or if there's like another explanation a logical explanation for it. And it leaves off, it's a bit ambiguous whether or not this haunting is actually real, and you kind of have to like figure it out along with the characters. It's not really obvious one way or the other. And this was just a really, really entertaining book. One of the best middle grade books I've read in a long time, or middle grade horror books at least. So yeah, this is The Ghost Next Door. I highly recommend checking this one out if you're into reading children's books as I am. Next up, I read Lord of the Flies by William Golding. And of course, this is a pretty well-known classic. And unfortunately, I just didn't really care for this one. I think I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, maybe 2.5 out of 5 stars. And yeah, this one just didn't speak to me. And it seemed really repetitive too. And I understand that's kind of the point of it. These kids are just wandering around on this island with nothing to do and just doing the same thing day in, day out. But it just, I don't know. I didn't really care for Lord of the Flies. I'm sorry. I'm probably the only person in the world to say that. But yeah, didn't really care much for this book. I just thought it was kind of dull. Next up, I read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And this was a really good book. I give this one a 4 out of 5 stars. And this book is, well, it's about Christianity, in case you wouldn't have guessed that. And so, yeah, this was just a really interesting book. C.S. Lewis writes in a way that's like very, very like humble and modest. He doesn't try to like, he's not very preachy, overly preachy or anything like that. He basically just kind of shares his own experiences and observations. He sort of breaks down the Christian religion into a very like simple and easy to understand way. And yeah, it's just really interesting how he goes about it. And I feel like it's a good book for maybe those who are a little bit curious about it and want to learn more about it, but don't want to be preached at or like talked down to. C.S. Lewis certainly does not do any of that here. It's just a very like easily accessible book. And I feel like it's also a good book for the more seasoned Christians who maybe want to look at their faith in a way they haven't before. There's a lot of points in here that C.S. Lewis talks about, things that I've never even really thought much of. And yeah, this was just a really interesting book. I really liked it. So yeah, Mere Christianity. I gave this one 4 stars. Next up, we have a Fear Street book, R.L. Stine's The Dead Lifeguard. This one is a super chiller. And this one is probably one of my favorite Fear Streets I've read so far. Probably like in my top 5. And yeah, this was a really fun one. And it takes place in the summertime at like this lifeguard camp, or I forget what they called it in the book, but there's like this lifeguard club, I think is what it is actually. And our main character, she goes to work at this lifeguard club, and she like forgets, I don't know, like she has like sort of amnesia, kind of like partial amnesia, I guess. I don't know. And after a while, after she stays at this lifeguard club, some of the lifeguards start disappearing. They not disappearing, but they're getting like killed off one by one. And she's trying to figure out what's going on. And there's rumors of a ghost like haunting the place. And yeah, this was a really good book. I really liked this one. The mystery had me. Of course, there's a lot of the cheesy teen, like 90s dialogue in here. Very, very 90s book. And one of the things I really liked about this book, too, is it kind of threw me for a loop a little bit. R.L. Stine uses some misdirection in here, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I thought I knew exactly where this book was going, and I was wrong. So there's some implications towards like some supernatural stuff going in here, and it ended up being something a little bit different. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, R.L. Stine caught me off guard with the multiple twist ending in this one, which is something he uses a lot, having multiple twists instead of just one like big twist. And yeah, it threw me off in this one. Dead Lifeguard, I think I gave 3.5 out of 5 stars. This was a pretty fun book. Definitely one of the better Fear Streets I've read so far. All right, moving on to Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Patterson. And this book is one of the small handful of books in my life to have brought me very close to tears. I'll just say that. This was an incredible book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It wasn't quite perfect, which is why I only gave it a 4. But it had me like very emotional at the end. I think I might have shed a few tears. This was a very good book. I feel like it's not really a spoiler. This is kind of an older book. And there's been a movie released on it that I feel like a lot of people have seen. But yeah, there's a tragedy in this book, and the way it's handled is just incredibly realistic, incredibly emotional. And this is just a very good middle grade book. I don't know what else to say about it. I love this. This book actually belongs to my mother. A couple of these other books I talked about too, Lord of the Flies, belong to my mother. So these didn't count towards my book challenge. But yeah, this was a great book, and I need to buy a copy of this for myself. Bridge to Terabithia, 4 out of 5 stars for that one. Next up, I read The Auctioneer by Joan Sampson. And this is like a classic, like paperbacks from hell type of horror book. I believe it was published in the 70s. And I've heard a lot of good things about this book. I finally decided to read it for myself. Unfortunately, it wasn't very good. So it's basically about this small town, this very small like country town in America, and there's this guy known as the Auctioneer. I believe his name is Pearly, and he slowly starts to like con people out of their stuff to put into his auction to fund like the police department and like fund these other like small group of people that is like supporting him. He's basically just taking the money for himself, and he's kind of a crooked guy. And it was kind of interesting at first. I was digging it in like the first, I don't know, third of the book or so. But after a while, I started to lose interest. The main thing that bugged me about it is the characters. The characters in this book are idiotic as hell. And the decisions they make, and in some cases lack of decisions, it just ruins it for me because it's not believable at all. The Auctioneer is literally going around like basically stealing stuff from all of these small town country folk and farmers in this town, and they're letting him get away with it. And that would never happen in real life. I don't know if Joan Sampson has never been to an actual small town in America, small town, but I don't know. I don't think they have because the actions and events that occur in this book, it just feels so unrealistic. And yeah, it was hard to get past for me. The characters did not feel realistic at all, and it really brought down my rating. And by the end of the book, I just didn't care what happened. So I gave this one a 2 out of 5 stars. Sorry, Joan Sampson, but The Auctioneer was just okay. It had an interesting concept. It reminded me a little bit of Stephen King's Needful Things. Kind of like a reverse Needful Things. Instead of Leland Gaunt giving people stuff, we have the auctioneer in here sort of like taking people's stuff. So yeah, it had kind of an interesting concept, but it just very, very poor execution in my opinion. So Auctioneer. Next up, I read The Monster Street, The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, part of the Monster Street series. This is the very first book in the series. And this is just a middle grade horror book, and it even has a blurb by R.L. Stine right on the cover here. Fast, funny, and frightening. And this book was decent. I enjoyed it. I wasn't really all that impressed with it. It definitely not borrows, but you definitely see a lot of influence from the Goosebumps books for this. This feels like a modern day Goosebumps book. There's a few unique twists and turns in it for sure. I don't think it's entirely derivative, but it's just not something I was overly impressed with. And I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy it. I liked it, but it's not a book I loved, and I'm not really sure if I'll continue reading the series or not. He's already got, I believe, 2 or 3 other books published in the series. There's a couple on the back there being advertised. What's the other one? The Halloweeners and Carn Evil. So I don't know. Maybe if I come across them, I'll read the other books in the series, but I'm not super hyped on like going to seek those ones out or anything. So yeah, that's the first Monster Street book. Next up, I read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I thought that I read this book when I was a kid, but I'm not 100% sure because I didn't really remember as I was reading. I remembered a little bit in the beginning, but that was about it. So either I just read this a really long time ago, or I'm thinking maybe I tried to read it as a kid and I didn't finish it. I really am not 100% sure. But anyway, I read it this month, and it's safe to say that this is now probably one of my favorite books of all time. I absolutely loved it. This is just such an action-packed, exciting book. There's lots of humor in here as well. And I can definitely see how the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which I feel like is probably the most well-known like pirate type of story in our culture, I feel like those movies have definitely drawn a little bit of inspiration from this book, even though they're quite a bit different. And yeah, this was just an incredible book. I absolutely loved it. I love Robert Louis Stevenson's writing. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about this one. This is a classic, guys. This is also my mother's book, by the way. So again, another book that did not count towards my book challenge. I probably would have finished my book challenge ages ago. I've read probably like 20 plus books by now that haven't counted towards it. Reading books that belong to my mom, borrowing books from the library, rereading some books. So yeah, I would have probably finished my book challenge a long time ago if I'd only read books that counted towards it, but oh well. So yeah, Treasure Island. I kind of wavered a little bit on what I wanted to rate this one. I wasn't entirely sure. I think I ended up settling on a 4.5 out of 5 stars, just because I feel like it wasn't quite perfect. I just rounded it up to 5 stars, though. I might as well, because I really can't think of any like major complaints or flaws I have with this book. Like, I enjoyed it very thoroughly, so I'll probably just round it up to a 5 stars, but I wouldn't say I enjoyed it nearly as much as some of like other 5-star books that I have. So, but yeah, Treasure Island. The next book I read is another Robert Louis Stevenson book, Kidnapped. And I believe I tried reading Black Arrow after Treasure Island, right before I started this one, and I couldn't get into it, like I said. So then I jumped to this one, and this one was really good as well. I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. This book is basically about this friendship between these two guys, a very unlikely friendship. This book is in part historical fiction from what I found out afterward. And it's basically about like, I'm going to sound like an idiot trying to explain it because I still don't entirely understand the whole thing. I haven't taken the time to research it. But it's basically about these different clans of families in England and Scotland, I believe. Right here, there's like a map on the back of Scotland. And there's just these rivalries between them and sort of like this war going on a little bit. And the main character here, he gets kidnapped, and he's about to be shipped off into slavery. And he encounters someone from an opposing political party from like a different clan on the boat. And they're both getting shipped off to slavery. And normally they should be hating each other according to their traditions or whatever, or their heritages, and they end up like working together to get off this boat, and they end up as like fugitives on the run from the law, and together they're basically just running and trying to stay alive and to get back in their own country and with their own people. And this was just a really, really good book. I was surprised how much I enjoyed this. And yeah, it's basically about this friendship between these two guys. And it's a very, very interesting friendship. Both characters are very layered, very likable people. Maybe not always likable. They have their flaws and such, and they do argue at times and even fight a little bit. But it was just really interesting. I really liked this book. I was not expecting it to be so good. I liked it almost as much as Treasure Island. Not quite. But yeah. And there's also a sequel to this book, what I found out afterward. So now I have to go and read the sequel. So yeah, Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I give this one a 4 out of 5 stars. And again, I think Stevenson is one of my favorite writers so far. The only book, like I said, that I haven't been able to finish by him was The Black Arrow. And I've liked just about every short story I've read by him. So yeah. All right, I'm done talking about Robert Louis Stevenson. The next book that I read is another middle grade book, and it is Tales of King Arthur by Felicity Brooks. And this is a like modern kids retelling of the classic King Arthur stories. This is a book I've had since I was a kid. I read it a lot when I was younger, and I wanted to reread it as an adult, and I still really enjoyed it. This is a fun little book, and even though this is more of like a kid's retelling, and the writing is very simple and straightforward, there's not a lot of detail. There's still some pretty edgy stuff in here. It doesn't shy away from some of the more mature themes that you might find in the original King Arthur stories, even though I haven't really read those yet, I guess, so I don't know how I can say that. But like there's some references to more suggestive content in here, and also like some violence and stuff as well. And it will even say like certain knights or characters like would decapitate another knight or something along those lines. And I was like, geez, like, so there are times in here where the author doesn't really shy away from the more violent details, the gritty details of the King Arthur stories. But yeah, this was really good. And excuse me, even though it's like a collection of short stories, they can be read alone, or they can also be read in order as a book because they sort of go in chronological order. It starts with The Sword and the Stone, of course, the classic story where one of the young knights pulls the sword out of the stone. Then you also have The Gathering of the Knights, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, The Last Battle, all of those classic stories. And yeah, this was a really fun book. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. A great book to introduce kids to the classic King Arthur stories. This is the book that introduced me to those stories. So yeah, Tales of King Arthur. We're almost finished here, guys, but I gotta take a drink real quick because my throat is killing me. Okay. Next up, I read Beware by R.L. Stine. Now, this was the book I referenced earlier when I talked about The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. And this is a collection of R.L. Stine's favorite scary stories. He edited this book. He has a couple of his own stories in here as well, but it's basically a collection of stories and poems. And there's also an old like comic story in here from a Vault of Horror magazine, which is really interesting. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, right here. And I actually really enjoyed this one too. I thought it was great. And yeah, this is basically a bunch of stories that he picks out, stories he really liked, and decided to compile them in a book. And I had a lot of fun reading this. I thought it was a great book. I liked almost every single story in here. I think there were maybe two that I didn't really care for out of this entire book. And there's quite a few stories in here, as well as a few poems. This was a really good book. I really enjoyed this. I think my favorite stories were, excuse me, The Black Ferris by Ray Bradbury. I really enjoyed the short poem My Sister is a Werewolf by Jack Perlutsky. The Conjure Brother by Patricia McKissack was a really good story. And yeah, this one also, of course, has the Judge's House. And R.L. Stine decided to retell it, I guess, because with it being like an older story, I think he was afraid kids might not be able to understand or follow along very well. So he did like a retelling of it. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just shortened a little bit and, yeah, told in more modern language, easier to understand. And I think it also did exclude some of the nittier, grittier details. The Judge's House was a little bit dark and I think had some more violent details in the original version. Not by a lot, but a little bit that I remember. So, yeah, he did a retelling of that. And yeah, this was just a really good book. I had a blast reading this, and I will say that R.L. Stine has great taste in literature. All right, next up, I read I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And this also has some short stories in it as well. And it was just okay. I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. Sorry, I know this is another really popular classic that I probably should love like everyone else does, but there's something about Matheson's writing that I can't connect with in novel form. I found I do really like some of his short stories though, but for some reason I've never been able to connect with his writing. And I also read Hell House, and that one was just okay. I liked it more than this one a little bit too, I think. But there's a couple short stories in here that I really, really liked. The very first one is Buried Talents, and it's a very short story. It's only a few pages long, but I really liked that one. It was fantastic. And then the other short story in here that I enjoyed was Madhouse. And I think I liked that short story more than the I Am Legend book, to be honest. So yeah, I didn't read every short story in here because some of them are ones I've previously read from another Richard Matheson story collection. So I didn't read every short story in this book, but yeah. I Am Legend itself, I gave 2.5 out of 5 stars. I just rounded it up to 3. And I mean, it was okay. I didn't dislike it. It just feels like something I've read 100 times by now. And I'm sure back when this came out in the 50s, it was, a lot more original and shocking and surprised people and everything. A lot more unique. But it just feels like something I've read and seen over and over again at this point. And I have seen both movie adaptations as well, and the Vincent Price film from the 1950s, I believe, called The Last Man on Earth. And that movie follows very closely to what happens in this book. So I think having seen that movie beforehand also like killed some of the stuff in here for me. Like I kind of knew what was going to happen. So yeah, it was just okay, I guess. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And then the very last book that I read this month was Witch by Christopher Pike. And this is the first Christopher Pike book I've read as an adult. I read 2 or 3 of his books when I was younger. I don't really remember them all that well. And this book was a lot different than I expected. I thought it was going to be more of a horror story focused on witchcraft. And I picked this one up at a used bookstore a long time ago because I like the subgenre of like witches and witchcraft within horror stories. Unfortunately, that's not really what this is. It's not even really a horror story. So it kind of starts out our main character explaining that she's a witch and she's like, I don't know, a good witch, I guess. And then she explains how she uses white magic to heal others of like their sicknesses and things like that. And she sees this vision where somebody she knows dies in a gas station holdup or a liquor store holdup. And she tries to prevent the vision only to cause another disaster. Things sort of go on in an unexpected turn. Somebody else ends up in trouble. And she sort of goes on this revenge spree. She basically is just filled with this hatred towards this person who is responsible for the crime. Yet she sort of goes on this revenge spree along with one of her other friends. And it turns into like this revenge thriller with a lot of action and violence. Very, very violent for a young adult book. I will say that. Pike does not restrain himself at all here. Unlike, R.L. Stine does in his Fear Street books. This book just goes all out. There's very violent. There's a lot of raunchy stuff in here as well with the dialogue. And yeah, I was not expecting it at all. And it was very gripping at times, don't get me wrong. It was very suspenseful, very gripping. I was surprised to see that Christopher Pike's writing is pretty solid for the most part, very easy to read book, very smooth flow. But it was just a little bit too much for me. Not too much in the sense that it was too shocking or too gory or anything, just too much in the sense that it was a bit unrealistic. It didn't feel believable at all. It was just so ridiculous in the violence that just kept mounting and mounting. And the decisions that the characters made just made no sense at all. And yeah, I'm just like, what am I reading? Like, I feel like this is one of those newer Fast and Furious movies where just the action is just so over the top and ridiculous that it's impossible to believe. And that's what I'm comparing it to, as a Fast and Furious film. So yeah, by the end, and it just like continued moving at like that breakneck pace. It never really come back down to a grounded level for me. I really liked it starting out, but it just went in some crazy directions, and it never come back down to ground level for me. By the end, I didn't really care that much what happened, unfortunately. And yeah, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. It had some things I liked about it, but overall, I felt a little bit more disappointed with it than anything. And it also got very melodramatic at times, especially towards the end. The aspect of her being a witch comes back into play towards the climax of the story. She has to try to save somebody and use her powers. But of course, along with that, there comes these consequences. And it's supposed to be all very emotional and moving and all of this, but I didn't really care, to be honest. It just felt melodramatic to me, and I was just like, I don't care. So yeah, Witch by Christopher Pike, I give it a 3 out of 5 stars. And I don't know if I'll be reading more by Christopher Pike. I might eventually, but I'm not going to go out of my way to buy more of his books. So yeah, that was the very last book I read this month. And that is it, guys. That is all 17 books that I read this month, and all the short stories, and I'm starting to lose my voice, so let me know what your thoughts are on any of these books if you've read them. And that's all I have for today, guys, so thanks for watching. Peace.